Koto katoa, a warm greeting to all our viewers tonight. We are lucky to have 35 plus people joining us, and that could be more people, of course, if there's more than one person at a screen. Tonight, we are privileged and fortunate to have Boyd Klap from Anne Frank, New Zealand joining us, along with his colleague from the Holocaust Centre, Tom Rockman-O'Reilly. So a warm welcome to you both. I'm aware that although I'm speaking from here in Timaru, you're in Wellington, and there could be viewers around the country and possibly even elsewhere in the world tonight, which is a wonderful thing. Now, just so everyone is aware of what we are doing, tonight we are going to be inviting Boyd very shortly to address us. We were lucky to have Boyd come down in February, and Boyd and Tom come down in February with the opening of the Anne Frank Let Me Be Myself exhibition here in the South Canterbury Museum in Timaru. And Boyd spoke at that exhibition opening, and unfortunately, because of the Omicron situation, we were very limited in numbers that we could have in. And I was so aware that we had a wonderful opportunity to have Boyd addressing a wider audience, and I wanted to see that happen. And given the situation that we're in at the moment, this appears to be the way that we do it online. Now, just a couple of things about how this is going to work tonight. I would invite everyone who is not speaking, which is actually everyone except Boyd, possibly Tom and myself, to turn off your cameras, turn off your microphones, and that will enable the screen to focus on whoever's speaking at the time. We are recording tonight's conversation, and the aim is that I know a lot of people will be interested in hearing this after the event, and that's the great thing about this technology. We are able to record it and then present it online for further viewing by those that could not be here tonight. It's also been brought to my attention that unfortunately the museum made a slight mistake. One of the communications that went out had a wrong date for this talk, so there may be one or two people that have been inconvenienced and will miss it. Therefore, recording it is another way in which we can guarantee that this talk will be available for a wider audience, which is great. Now, we're having this talk, as I mentioned, because Boyd came down and spoke at the opening of the current exhibition at the South Canterbury Museum, Anne Frank, Let Me Be Myself. This is a touring exhibition from Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, and I'm sure Boyd will be able to talk very eloquently about what the exhibition is about and how it came to be here in New Zealand. From our point of view as a museum, it's a wonderful thing to have here. We aren't able to host a lot of smaller traveling shows. We just don't have the space. This one, by working with Tom and her team at the Holocaust Centre, we were able to ensure that it was designed to fit into the space that we've got. And it was a bit of a shoehorning exercise, but we were able to get all of the historic panels which reflect Anne Frank's story into the exhibition. So this exhibition is running currently through until the 1st of May. Now, one development which I hope will increase the audience, a bit of news, as of tonight at 11:59, the Timaru District Council has removed the vaccine pass mandate on all cultural facilities. So you don't have to have a vaccine pass to come into the museum from tomorrow. So we do look forward to seeing those people who were not able to get in while that mandate is in place. It will be great to have you with us. Finally, just a personal note, again, I was so impressed when Tom and Boyd came down for the opening of this exhibition. And to reiterate what I said earlier, when Boyd spoke, the room was transfixed. We didn't have anywhere near the number of people we would normally hope to get in at an exhibition opening. And I knew we needed a wider audience. And my hope is that not just the people that are here tonight, but also people that will view this recording after the event will be able to appreciate Boyd's story and his role in bringing this critical message that's just as relevant today as it was 60, 80 years ago to a wider audience. I could talk a lot about you, Boyd, I suspect, because you really impressed me when you came down here. If I'm anywhere near as fit and fiddle as you are at 95, I will be so happy. You know, was so blown away by your energy, your passion, your enthusiasm, and your warmth. And I'm hoping that tonight people will understand why you are so good at doing what you're doing, and also why your passion and your belief has led to this exhibition not just being in our museum, but also in museums around the country. So on that note, Boyd, I'm going to invite you to take the stage. I'm going to turn off my mic and my camera, and as I will encourage anyone else to do who's not speaking. And also, with the Teams program, you do have the ability to type in questions on the chat function. So if you do have a pertinent, relevant question that you would like to raise, I will record those and we'll have a chance for Boyd to be asked those questions by us at the end of his talk. Boyd, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Philip. What an introduction. I'll try and not let you down. Kia ora, shalom, goedenavond, good evening, everybody. Yeah, this is a wonderful way of communicating, isn't it? Here I'm sitting on my own. You're sitting in your living rooms probably, or maybe in your studies, maybe some of you in your offices, and we are talking to each other. I'm not just talking to you. I hope that after I have finished my talk, you'll talk to me. So here we are, 77 years after this teenage girl, Anne Frank, died in Bergen-Belsen, and we're talking about it. Now, going back to the opening that Philip mentioned on the 3rd of February, it was a difficult one. I mean, I had to decide whether I was prepared to be in an airport, to sit in a plane, to meet people, then to have a dinner and go back. And the people that came had the same issues. Can I attend, and is it the right thing to do? And I thank the 60 people that were there, because that was the maximum that the museum could take with the distances between people. I thank you for coming. And although it was not a big night in terms of people, it was a very warm, emotional night. It felt good. It felt as good as the best ones I've been to. Amongst those present was also a member of parliament, Jackie Dean, and I was delighted that your mayor, Philip Howe, was there and opened the exhibition. And he did so with a lot of knowledge about the Holocaust, about the Shoah. He did so with emotion, and I was very impressed. And I was even more impressed when he took me out for dinner afterwards. We had a lovely time. So thank you, Philip. Thank you all for doing that. You think that now with the COVID situation with Omicron, that numbers would be right down?
I don't cry much, but
Boyd, can I just interrupt there for a second? Someone has got a TV or a radio on. Please mute your microphones. Turn your microphones off, audience. We do not want to hear extraneous noise. Thank you so much. Sorry, Boyd, carry on,
that's
please.
okay, Phil. No, okay. What I was going to say was, you do expect less people. There are people who are very concerned. As we know, cities are very quiet at present. And therefore, this change in the rules announced yesterday will make a big difference to you, I think. And I'm certain that in the next 6 to 8 weeks, you'll have a large number of people coming. And in particular, parents who are listening, do take your kids, or grandparents, take your grandchildren, because the future of our planet depends on young people knowing what happened before, to make certain that never happens again. See, we're in Timaru here 77 years after she died in Bergen-Belsen. This young woman, who was probably the teenager of the century, died in the most horrific conditions of typhoid. She was put in Bergen-Belsen. She lost her mom and dad. She had her sister with her, Margot. Margot died. You can just imagine. I've heard of stories what she looked like those last few days, and I don't want to go into detail because it's too sad. And it's another thing I'd like to mention, and there's the lockdowns that we've had. You in Timaru and South Canterbury have not had the same as people in Auckland. And if there are people in Auckland listening, and I'm sure there are some, you had a 2 month lockdown and it was bad. But if you think of that, and then you think of Anne Frank, who had a lockdown for more than 2 years, and not on her own, a young teenager who came in at 13, developed from a young girl into a young woman, with older people. She couldn't go outside or she would die. She couldn't go to the windows because that would be dangerous. They couldn't even flush the toilet during the day because that would give them away. So I think if we look at what we experience, and it has been a very difficult time for many of us, but we compare that with this young woman and Frank, it's nothing. And what she did in those circumstances, and then write this diary, is just incredible. What actually happened was that she was a German girl. She came from Frankfurt. After Hitler and after the start of the pogroms, she and her family came to Holland. But she was German speaking. But she was a clever girl. She learned perfect Dutch, and she wrote her diary actually in Dutch. Now, she was writing this up when the Minister of Education of the Dutch government, that was on exile in London, suggested that people write a diary so that history would not be lost. And she then rearranged the diary in the notes she had into a diary. And of course, when she and her whole family and the other people in the house were arrested, the papers were left behind and on the floor. And the woman in the business in front of their hiding place saw those papers, put them together, and kept them until after the war, Otto, Anne's dad, came back from Russia and found those papers. When he found those papers, he was not immediately impressed because Anne was an outspoken girl and she was way ahead of her age. She talked about how, as a young girl, she became a woman and went into detail. She talked about equality between women who have a significant role. She talked about her mother, who she didn't like much. She was a teenager and she loved her dad. And Otto kept the book away. In fact, there was the first publication where certain things were left out of it. And a few things were put into the next publication. And you know, this diary of this young 15-year-old girl is now in 72 countries, 72 languages. And it is in the most 10 read books of the world. It is quite amazing. So here we are today, and we're looking at the things that are happening. I'll talk about the exhibition in a minute. There's one thing that happened in New Zealand too. I was in Parihaka, and we were talking there. I was asked to give an address at the Marae. Very impressive. And at the end of my talk about Anne Frank and about the diary, a woman said, "Boyd, has the diary ever been translated into Te Reo Maori?" I had no idea. I went home and, yep, 72. And I'd just like to show you that because this is Anne Frank, Te Rataka a Tatahi Kohine. This is the Anne Frank diary in Te Reo. We are very proud of that. Last week, a Kiwi-based Maori organization acquired 500 books to make certain they go into the homes, as Te Reo Maori is becoming more and more part of the New Zealand DNA. The exhibition of Anne Frank is changed from time to time. There are several exhibitions. The first one I brought to New Zealand was called The History for Today. It very much focused on just the Holocaust, 17 panels, and as a young girl, the Kristallnacht and the steps towards the control, etc. The exhibition Let Me Be Myself, which is now in Timaru, is a little bit wider, although the focus has to be the Shoah. There's nothing that can compare with the misery of the Shoah. But there is also something like discrimination that happens today. I talked about Parihaka, what happened in New Zealand history, and what really is important that in the last few days the Prime Minister has announced that we are going back to the real history of New Zealand. Not the things that we like to know, but the things that we need to know. And I think that's going to be very much part of it. And the other thing is bullying. I read the other day that we as a country, where we are the best in many things, we have the highest rate of youth suicide in the OECD countries. That is, to me, unbelievable in this wonderful country. And a lot of it has to do with bullying, with people put down, becoming depressed, and in some cases, taking their lives. So we have added to the exhibition a contemporary exhibition of young people who look different, who don't play rugby and are art, whatever. Or like people who just speak different because they come from another language and have been bullied. And we have added, we are the only of two countries in the world, we've added two New Zealand panels, one of a Maori boy talking about his granddad being given the strap for speaking to Reo Maori and how it has changed, but how discrimination has been very difficult in his family. And then there was an English girl who came to New Zealand and she didn't know Vegemite and Marmite. She didn't know the difference. And she had a funny accent and she had a tough time. So we are focusing on those aspects as well, but not at the expense of the show. That is the most significant thing. No. So the exhibition, I don't need to talk about it in great detail. It is in Timaru, and I hope that people in South Canterbury listen to it now and maybe listen to it later. Please go to the exhibition and take your family. It's going to be in Gisborne after Timaru. It's then going to be in Rotorua, and it will be in the New Zealand Parliament in Wellington in November, December. People say sometimes to me, Boyd, you're not a Jew. Why are you so involved in this? And I'd have to say that 13 years ago, and I had a career in insurance in Australia and New Zealand at executive roles, that I knew as much about Anne Frank as you probably do. You might have read the diary at school. But there was a woman, Wolf, in Wellington, who was a prominent person in the community and very significant at a time when women were not really in leading positions. And she started the Holocaust Center. She asked me after a while, because we became very close friends, whether I would help this young man who came from Amsterdam, who could not get into any museum. Could I somehow help him for 3 months? Well, that's 13 years ago, and that's a long 3 months, but it's been absolutely fantastic. We've had 40 exhibitions throughout Australia and New Zealand, from Perth to Invercargill, from Whangarei to Bilkrutha. And in Australia, where I stepped down as chairman 4 years ago, it's still going, it's fully booked, and the project director there rings me from time to time. It's great. And the same thing is happening here. Now, during the war in Holland, I was 13 when the Germans invaded Holland. And I'm not a person who lives in the past, although I want to learn from the past. But when Big Russia invaded Ukraine, it did bring me back to the 10th of May, 1940, when Big Germany invaded Little Holland and started bombing the cities. I remember lying in bed at night and heard the big bombers, the Heinkels, coming over. And that started a 5-year occupation where I was 13 when it started and 18 when we were liberated. And these are formative years. These are years when you take in what happens in your environment. And I think it shapes your future to some extent. So I'll tell you a few things that happened that made me wanting to be close to the Jewish community. My neighbors were the Goshaliks, and they had a little boy, Heinemann. What happened was, after about 2 years, people started painting swastikas on their doors or on the street in front, or they started smashing things at the house. The people in the neighborhood really came to her help and really try to clean up the swastikas and the bad words that were put there against the Jews. But one day, the Gauss and little Heinemann left. They were arrested to go to Germany. They probably wouldn't have known what happened. But what happened was that they were killed in the Holocaust. They didn't come back. There's another story, and it involves my late wife, Ria. When I first met her, we were looking after displaced people from Arnhem, where the battle had taken place with Montgomery. And I met her. In fact, she always tells me that she fell in love with me because my sandwiches were much better than her sandwiches. But that was the start of 62 years marriage. And I lost her 10 years ago. But when I first met her and I came to her home, there was something eerie. I knew there was something not right. I didn't know what it was. But what it was they were hiding a German Jew, Günther Rose. And of course, they did not know whether they could trust me. I could have been a collaborator, it could have been anybody. So it took a little while before I knew and met Günther, who, by the way, survived the war, as did his parents. An interesting little side issue. She was 16, my girlfriend at the time, had to sleep with her mother. And you think, why? Well, if there was a search, as happened all the time by collaborators, Germans or whoever, Tom would leave his bed. He started hiding between the ceiling and the floor above, and Ria would hop into his bed. You can imagine, if there was an empty hot bed, there was something wrong. There was somebody somewhere. There was another thing that happened too, is my mother-in-law and Ria, her father had died 3 years before, had neighbors. They were also Jews. Jews were part of the Netherlands in 1600, actually. And they were very much part of that. They were pastry people. And Saartje was her name. They had to report. Nobody knew what they were going to do. They thought they were going to a working camp. And, they were out in the street. The truck was there to take them in. And my mother-in-law went down with a thermos and sandwiches. And she said to Saartje, you have 2 boys. If you like, I'll look after them until after the war. And you go and do whatever happens in Germany. But as a mother, she didn't want to do that. She wanted to keep the kids with her. She took her ring off and gave that ring to my mother-in-law. You know, my mother-in-law wore that ring all her life. And then my wife did until she died. And then my daughter, Jackie, she wears that ring. And I've asked Jackie sometimes when I give a public address somewhere, do you mind if I take the ring? She's born in New Zealand. She's committed to that. She said that ring never leaves my finger. And the final story might also be of interest. The de facto father of my wife, her dad died young, he was a reserve territorial major. After about a year, maybe a year and a half, he was arrested with other officers, starting an underground organization. And they were all condemned to death. He was put in a hospital because he had been tortured to the extent that he couldn't stand. They got him standing and took him outside and shot him. Now, this is all pretty dramatic stuff, but it was dramatic. And it was part of our life. Things happened all the time. Air raids, bombs were dropped, people died in the streets. But the main thing that I kept out of those years is that the worst thing in the world is discrimination. And the other thing is that if something bad happens, make certain that you work towards it never happening again. And I think that's the Anne Frank exhibition. Well, if we look at the numbers, 1.5 million Jewish children were killed. over 6 million people. But it wasn't only that. I had a meeting with the new Hungarian ambassador yesterday, and he talked about how also the Romans in Hungary were persecuted and killed. And there were the people who were disabled. In my hometown, there was what we used to call, well, it was an institution for mental people. These days we talk about these things different. But when the Germans started to take more and more control, I remember that all these poor people in this mental institution, they were hauled out on wheelbarrows and carts and everything else. They were also taken to Germany and they were killed. So it was even wider than the big thing, which was the Holocaust. Now, a little bit about the exhibition is it's been going around the world now for many, many years. And as I said earlier in my introduction, I've been involved 13 years. We have by now reached 500,000 people. We've been in 40 venues. I won't go to all the 40 venues, but we have. And you wonder, and you may ask me, does it have an impact? And how do we know? But I used to be the chairman of the Life Education Trust. Some of you who have young children may know it from school, with health, etc. And one of the people who had started it, who was really the missionary, I was just the bloke running it. I said to him, Trevor, do you think it really makes an impact? And he said, Boyd, if we save one life, it's worth it. But I'm certain that what's happened here, in the 500,000 people that we have reached in the last few years, many, many people have come to realize how significant the Holocaust was and what we need to do in this world, which is becoming more anti-Semitic, which is so sad. We need to all fight. And I think sometimes they say, why do you as a non-Jew fight for this? I think, of course, you would fight for it, but people would say they naturally do. But if, as a non-Jew, you fight for it, people know that you have a real passion, the same passion, but maybe more passion, because you are committed to something that doesn't affect you personally. Well, I've got something here, which is the last statement of Anne Frank. And she said, despite everything, I believe that people are really good at heart. And I do too. Of course, we have bad experiences. People put it across you sometimes, but most people are really good at heart. And I hope that the many people in South Canterbury, not just the ones that are listening tonight, but your friends, your family, all come to this exhibition and experience what the Anne Frank story is like. Because the horrors of the Holocaust, as it is in Hebrew, the Shoah, must never be lost and must be passed to future generations so that it never happens again. Thank you. And I'm very happy to take questions.
Kia ora, Boyd. That is a wonderful personal account that we've just heard. And folks, here's the chance for you to ask questions. We would invite you, if you can, to feed them into the chat function on the Teams program. While you're doing that, and just thinking about the questions you might want to ask, just a couple of things from the museum. We've had the exhibition here running now for about a month, and I've been delighted to talk to people about their impressions of the exhibition, but also the fact that the Anne Frank story is one that everyone knows. I think most of us would have grown up with the book, known about it, known the story. And yes, it's history. It's a long time ago, but it's just as relevant today. And when we see what's happening around the world, not just in the Ukraine, or Ukraine as it's known now, but also other countries, and in some places it's been going on for years and years. There's so much that we need to understand about other people's experiences. And this exhibition it's aimed at a wide audience, and I've also been pleased at the way in which young people in particular have been engaging with it, and our educators, despite the difficulties with Omicron at the moment here in the community, have been working with a couple of schools and even recruiting peer tutors, students who will learn about the exhibition so they can talk with other people. Now, I'm just looking through the chat, and I'm going to read out some of the questions that have been asked. There's one here, and this is, I guess it's a contemporary one. It is, how is Boyd, as someone that experienced the Nazi occupation firsthand, how does Boyd feel about people that compare the anti-vaccination government restrictions to the Holocaust? Boyd, that's quite a meaty question. I know it's one you've talked a little bit about with me when you were down here.
Yeah, to be quite honest, I found it an impossible question. I mean, how can you, for heaven's sake, compare the death of 1.5 million children, of 6 million Jews, of Romans? How can you compare it with anything else? It's been one of the worst things that have happened in our modern civilization, maybe ever in our civilization. So I cannot see any connection. Yeah, look, I believe strongly in democracy. I believe strongly in the fact that people can make a decision whether they want to be vaccinated or not vaccinated. I'm vaccinated. I do want to protect my health, but I have a very good friend who I presently can't see because she's not allowed to go into a restaurant. She's totally opposed. That's okay. But to compare that particular happening, which is unpleasant, but to compare that with what happened in the Holocaust, I think is, to be quite honest, as far as I'm concerned, quite absurd.
Thank you. There's another question here. Recently, news came through that they had identified who betrayed the Frank family. Has this been confirmed?
Well, that's very interesting. You see, they've always wondered what happened. They were collaborators. They were Dutch guys that came and took the family and the other people in the Achterhuis, as it was called, where they were hiding, took them away. Nobody ever knew, and there have been people that they were convinced were involved. There was one particular person that they focused on for a long time, a collaborator. And then, not so long ago, in the last year, a book came out where these people said they had investigated the whole thing very thoroughly, and it was a notary public, which is sort of a senior lawyer type in Amsterdam, who actually was Jewish, who would have given the names of people in order to save his own family. I mean, it's a horrible story, really, and you can imagine how the family of that man feel. There was a lot of discussion, but yesterday, many scientists and prominent people have investigated that case, and it has completely squashed that it was any good. And the publisher has publicly apologized for the statement made, and the book will not have a second print run and has been taken off the market. So the upshot is that we do not know who was the person who gave the Germans the names of these Jewish people, where they were hiding. We don't know, but it certainly wasn't that particular man. And you can imagine that his granddaughter currently is very publicly reacting to that book, but now to the big apology. I'm delighted that the apology came. Because that's cleared something. And it is not just from a few people, it's from a large group of very prominent historians.
Right. We've got a high school teacher actually based in Queenstown asking, I've got a unit developed around the Holocaust. Is there anything in particular you would suggest we need our youth to know? Quite a big question, really.
Well, there's the Holocaust itself, which is being taught in the schools. And of course, the Holocaust Center of New Zealand, who I'm associated with, have education people or an education manager who goes around the various schools. But I think that there are two subjects as far as I can see, and I'm not an educator, but one is the Holocaust itself. People need to know that, and that needs to be taught. And I think separate from that, especially for young people, the Anne Frank story is worthwhile. By the way, I had the early exhibition in Aerotown, A History for Today. It was one of the most successful ones. And just to the high school teacher in Queenstown, I'm just thinking of bringing it back there. So you might have the Anne Frank exhibition there if I can find the right venue. But yeah, I think there is enough material. And of course, I'm quite certain that the Holocaust Center here would be very happy to provide information. Tom, would you like to say something about that?
I'll jump
Yeah.
here. Hello, everyone. My name is Tom. I'm a project manager in the Holocaust Center of New Zealand. I think because we don't have online here our education director, the best thing, no, I will put it this way. We do have a project that's called banners, that's called trunks, that in that trunk you're getting some sort of book units to teach children, and also how to teach about the Holocaust and different stories about the Holocaust, because you can look at it and I want to say research it in many different angles. And I'm going to share in the chat the contact details of our education director, his email address, and you guys can forward, and I'm encouraging you to step forward and write an email, and we will be happy to come forward and do something that adjusts to your school specifically.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
That's great.
Yeah,
And actually,
right.
if I can just join in there with what you've just mentioned, Tom, one of the things we'll do from the museum side, we will have this talk available as a recording, probably from our Facebook page, and we can also put those links there, just so they're widely available. In a similar vein, there's another question here. What are the main points of Anne Frank's story that make Kiwi teenagers identify with Anne?
So, Philip, is your question to what extent teenagers can identify with Anne Frank? Is that?
I think so. Yeah. The question, I'm just reading it from the chat here. Yeah.
Well, what is interesting is at some of the venues we had like a visitor's book, and people could put comments in it. These comments were amazing, and they were like, I remember one because that sort of stuck with me. This girl said, "I have problems with everything. It's not very good between me and my boyfriend. I have difficulty with homework. But Anne, you've taught me that I live in a wonderful country and that my problems are only minor. Thank you for helping me." So there are many messages there that indicate by young people, mainly in the same age group, who realize what a wonderful person Anne Frank was, how much wisdom there is in her diary, but also how lucky we are to live in New Zealand. That comes through very clear every time. Does that sort of?
Yeah, I guess. And I mean, my comment that I'd add to that is I think the way Anne writes in her, or wrote in her diary, I think a lot of people of different ages can relate to it. We've all been teenagers. We've all grown through those years. And for teenagers today, there'll be, even though it seems like the history of the old days, it's not, because human experience is universal. Now, Boyd, there's another question here asking you directly, as a young man growing up in the Netherlands, what awareness did you have of the fate of the people being taken away by the Germans? And if you had awareness, how did that impact you and your family?
No, I wasn't aware at all. Slowly, as the Germans took more and more control and put collaborators in roles like mayors, and the principal of my school was an SS man who came came to school with a revolver. That's a separate story. We tried to help the Jews, but they thought really that they were going to a work camp, or maybe they were going to work in factories. I don't think they knew they were going to death camps. They didn't go to, for instance, the woman next to my mother-in-law would have left her kids behind, wouldn't she? But she didn't know. She thought she was, so I didn't know. And it was not until 1945, after the war was finished, and Eisenhower opened the Holocaust camps, or the death camps, and people saw what happened, these horrible pictures that we all have seen. It was then that we knew. But during the war, we did not really know. What we experienced was the local people who were killed. For instance, if something happened against a German soldier, local people that were in prominent positions, like a prominent lawyer, a doctor, they were executed and their bodies were left in the center of the city. So we saw incredible brutality at home, but the people that were going away, like a lot of young people like my age, I went into hiding because I was 18 and I had to report. But the people in hiding, they went to Germany to work in factories. But a lot of those died. They died in air raids. So no, we did not. I think that if I look at history, that it is terrible that no action was taken with the trains that went to the death camp, because at senior Allied level, I believe there was knowledge. But to me, as an ordinary young guy in a little town in Holland, no idea at all.
Now, there's another question here. When you talk with students who visit the exhibition, do you find out what they know about the New Zealand Jewish community? Are they curious about it? Have many met New Zealand Jews?
The Jewish community is not very large in New Zealand. And I think maybe in a place like Auckland, there would be more people that would have had contact with Jewish people than in the South Island, like in Timaru. But that applies to all ethnic groups. I mean, I'm not saying that the Jews are not different, because they are different. But I mean, when I came in 1951, this was an Anglo-Saxon country where you had to fit in, and you had to be a Kiwi. I mean, you can be a Kiwi without losing your identity, as Jews have always done, and as I do. But that's how it was. I'm not so certain that there is a great deal of knowledge of the Jewish background. I think there is something that could be done, because so many Jews at the top level have made a major contribution to this country, and I'm not going to mention names, but there are obvious many names and organizations that are Jewish organizations. So I think that young people, by and large, and this is only me not being an expert, I don't think they know really.
Sure. Actually, you just triggered a thought in my head. Here in Timaru, there was a synagogue in the late 19th century. We had a Jewish mayor and a moderately prominent but small Jewish community, but that all disappeared in the early 20th century. So that the Jewish community, if there were still members here, were very much an almost hidden minority, and yet for a while they were more prominent in civic affairs in the late 1800s. And that may be the case in other parts of New Zealand, not so much the larger cities, but just around the region, I think.
Yeah, it is the same in Nelson, actually. There was a synagogue, there was a Jewish community, and there's a little street named after the synagogue. Most people don't know about that. So there would have been original Jewish settlers who were very significant in small groups. But that sort of disappeared, as you say, at the beginning of the 20th century, maybe, or early.
Now, there's a couple of other questions, and I'm just aware of the time. We won't keep this going too long. So if you have a really burning question, folks, you better type it in fast. This one asks us, do you find that the school pupils who visit the exhibition know much about the history of the time when Anne was hiding? I guess the whole history of the war, what was happening with the Holocaust, the Nazi persecutions.
I think, you see, we're talking about 3 generations since. We're talking about 75 years. And unfortunately, things fade over time, And I think that now there is far less knowledge than there would have been 20 or 30 years ago, 50 years ago. I'm not so certain. See, I think in the New Zealand environment, many families had grandfathers who fought in the First and the Second World War. I think they know a lot about that war. They know quite a bit about Belgium, where incredible fighting took place and New Zealand soldiers were heroes. Whether they know much more detail, I don't know. And I think the exhibition and what Tom talked about can bring it more closer to home. And that's why we have brought the contemporary exhibition alongside the Anne Frank exhibition to bring it more part of today.
Right. A couple of other questions. One question here, how did the Dutch people treat Jewish people when they returned from the camps after the war ended?
Well, I was in the Dutch army after the war, and I fought another war as a young officer in the Dutch East Indies. So, and I never worked in Holland. I decided after I had studied tropical agriculture, I was going to be a tea planter, and I decided to come to New Zealand. I never planted tea, by the way. So I don't really know, but what I read about is that they were not well treated. I think that most people in Holland at that time had so much misery themselves for 5 years. They were too much focused on themselves. And these Jews came back. And they came back, okay, well, they need to find their own way. That's what I read may have happened. Over time, thank God it has changed. Only last year, the New Zealand Railways made a huge payment to the Jewish community in compensation for their trains taking Jews to Germany. I think that's fantastic. With other words, there is much more realization now what happened and what we need to do to compensate and to look after. The Amsterdam city was a very Jewish city. I think I read a book, a very big book about the Jewish history, and in 1600, when the Portuguese Jews came from Spain, they even called it Jerusalem of Europe, of the West. They were totally integrated and part of, and I think they were somewhat discriminated against, but nothing like what happened in Poland and other parts. So Jews were part of life, but they were a little bit of, maybe there was also a guilt feeling. See, of the 140,000 Jews, 100,000 were killed. That is an incredible high number. There are reasons for that. There are reasons that don't blame them, but there was a guilt feeling. There was we don't want to be involved. But that's completely changed, Philip. Everything is being done, and so it should be after 70 years, to compensate for the horrors that happened.
That's right. Now, we do have a couple of other questions that have come up, but how do you feel, Boyd? Are you at a point where you'd like to stop?
If people are not getting bored with me yet.
Oh, I'm not. And I'm sure some of my other audience members will feel the same. Okay. One person asked quite an interesting question. They've got, why do you, Boyd, as a non-Jewish person, working hard to commemorate, obviously, Anne Frank, a Jewish girl, have you ever thought or been involved with commemorating any other victims of the Holocaust?
Well, when you talk about the Holocaust, do we talk about other communities or within the Holocaust? Because as a Dutch person, I was the president and I started the New Zealand Netherlands Foundation. I marched with the Anzac people, with my gongs, and I was very much part of Anzac Day. I have laid wreath for on occasion, but I'm not quite certain whether you think are there Holocaust activities that I've been involved in. And then I can tell you, yes, many. I was, amongst other things, in Makara, which is the cemetery, where there is a Jewish part of the cemetery. And on the United Nations Day of the Holocaust, I was there, and I had the privilege, I was asked to speak at that function. I was very much part of that day. And there are many other parts and events that I've been involved in. So yes, no, it is an ongoing thing, and I can tell you that in these 13 years, I keep on learning, I keep on being more involved, and it is a near full-time activity, which I do with a great deal of pleasure.
Great, thank you. A question, just asking about your personal experiences as a young man needing to hide from the razzias or the roundups. How did you experience it? Did you feel extreme terror? What sort of emotions did you feel? Did you ever have a narrow escape, or did you ever nearly get caught?
Well, I don't talk about it a lot, but what happened was after Montgomery had Market Garden, the south of Holland, south of the Rhine River, was liberated and the north was not. But the north thought that we were going to be liberated, so the red, white, and blue flags came out, heroes from the underground came out, but the Germans were there. And unfortunately, another 8 months of occupation took place, and all these people that had come out in the open, they were all taken to Germany. Most of them were killed. In the underground, they were never all that keen to have young people because they like to brag and talk to their friends about it. But they now had to go to a younger generation, and I was one of those who then was recruited by the underground as a courier. And this may be of interest, is what happened really. There were German troop movements that were important. There were air raids, the bombs fell. Did they reach the targets that were intended to be reached? And all that type of thing. So I had, of course, I didn't go by my own name. I had another name. And somebody would come on a bike to me, take the saddle off the bike and took the papers out of it that were there. I might add something to it. And then I would circle 20K and give those papers to a person who I didn't know that person's name. And then that would be the next week, it would be radioed, or maybe even the next day, it would be radioed to London, so that in Britain, the Allied forces had direct information. So I was involved in that. There's another interesting thing. I don't like to talk about it much, but I think people find it interesting. When the Canadian forces were outside my little city, Deventer, which is a city that time of 40,000 people, my friend and I were able to, who was also a courier, we were able to disarm a couple of German soldiers and got the rifles off them. It was actually an easy one because they were pleased the war was over. But we were able to go through the lines to the Canadian. It was a bit risky, of course. On one side, you got the Germans. And I joined up with the Canadians. And they had 3 tanks that came in, and 1 tank was on the main street. And they asked me where were the German centers. And I crawled on top of the tank, and we drove into the city until it got a little bit dangerous. And I walked from there on. Well, anyhow, that story is very interesting because many, many years later, I was a keen skier in Queenstown, and I had a house built there, a badge. And I came, at the time I was living in Dunedin, I was manager for Otago in Southland. I came to this house when there was a plumber. And we had a beer together. He was a Canadian. And he said, where are you from originally? I said, oh, I'm from Holland. Oh, he said, I was there in the Canadian Army. I said, oh, really? What he said I was with the Regiment de Chauderie, French regiment, tank regiment. I said, oh, really? He said, where were you in Deventer? He said, oh, I liberated Deventer. And I stayed there for a while as the assistant to the mayor. And I said, now, there were 3 tanks that came in. One burst into flames, but the people were saved in the tank. And there was another one that went somewhere else. And there was one on the main street. And a young guy, 80-year-old in a blue overalls, clambered onto the tank. And he said, I was driving it. So that's quite an incredible story, isn't it, really?
It is. That's truly a fantastic story.
So how did it affect me? I was asked, Kim Hill interviewed me, and she said, was it bravoure? Did you, was it adventure or were you a patriot? And I think it's a bit of both. You see, when you're 18, I mean, I quite understand young people who get into difficulties because we're all a little bit stupid when we're young. and I didn't see danger really much at all. But it was also an adventure. But to me, I totally hated what the Nazis did. My uncle died in a bomb, in an air raid. Somebody else died in the family. And the stories I've told you. So, but when I became a courier in the resistance, to a large extent, it was to my commitment to get the freedom of the country and to get rid of the Nazis.
Great. Now, Boyd, one last question for you, and then I just see there's a question that I will answer after that. The question for you, Boyd, is when you talk to students, do you tell them about those wonderful people, the righteous amongst the nations? Do you think it makes the students think more about making choices in life?
Maybe I should. I mean, some of my friends in Holland were righteous people, but I have not actually used that in particular in my speeches. Sure. But it's a good point, actually. Yeah. Because these are people like my mother-in-law. She took a huge risk because my wife's brother was hiding from the Germans because he was a student. Students had to sign an allegiance to the German occupiers, or they couldn't study. And he didn't want to do that, so he went into hiding. So she had her son and a German Jew in hiding. What an incredibly brave woman. So these people that were righteous people, they were prepared to give their lives for other people and for freedom.
Yeah, that's right. On that note, I'm just mindful of the fact, Boyd, we've had you on the spotlight for close to an hour, and you have given us a wonderful insight, and by sharing your experiences, this has been just as I imagined it would after I heard you speak in February when you were down here with Tom. A wonderful experience for everyone, and my gratitude also to those who asked questions. There's a question that I will answer, and it's from someone which was here in the country, and that's Tracy at Hebden Bridge in Yorkshire, who's tuned in. Hi, Tracy. And Tracy's asking us, will the museum be providing webinar hybrid talks in the future? I think the answer would be yes. We did actually do one last year, and we look at how this has worked, how wonderfully it's worked tonight. So yeah, we will look at doing that where we can. I've got to admit, and I think, Boyd, I can speak for you on this, nothing beats having a real audience in front of you, because you can feed off that, you can engage with people, and I saw you doing that here in February. But having said that, the silver lining to the rather dark cloud we've faced for the last couple of years has been the increase in electronic communications like this, and it enables people to join us from Hebden Bridge in Yorkshire, or Temuka, or Wellington, or anywhere in Timaru, or New Zealand, or the globe. So it's been fantastic. So Boyd, on behalf of all of us who are taking part, who are listening to tonight, I want to thank you so much once again for your willingness to do this. I want to again express my amazement at how you are able to have the energy and passion and drive to share your stories and to keep doing that and to inspire people of all generations about something that happened a long time ago, but making it just as relevant for us to understand and to learn from today. So on behalf of all of us, thank you so much. And to all of you who have joined us tonight, thank you very much. And I look forward to seeing people again in the real in one of our sessions, but I also look forward to maybe having more opportunities like this to have a wider audience and to be able to share through digital means. This recording will be stopped shortly, but it will be available in a day or two on the museum Facebook page, and there may possibly on the museum website. And if you've got any other people who weren't able to get along tonight who would enjoy listening, by all means, feel free to share the link. And we'll look forward to seeing you all again sometime. And also, of course, I need to say the exhibition, if you're in South Canterbury or able to get to South Canterbury in the next month, come and see the exhibition and enjoy the experience, learn from the experience, and tell others about the experience. So thank you very much, Ka kite anō. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Philip.